I don't remember dying. I don't know how I came to be this way. I awoke, or perhaps was reborn as something other, yet I remained, trapped within the shell that could no longer support the life it had once housed. I looked down at myself, and felt no shock when I saw the blood soaking through my blouse. It ran down my front, pooling in my lap and spilling over to form two puddles on either side of my stretched and splayed legs on the cement floor. It was beginning to congeal. I laughed, but what came out was a choked, sobbing sound, raw and alien to my ears. I lifted my blouse and stared, fascinated at the meaty hole just beneath my bra line and between my ribs. It was pretty horrific, and I knew I should probably be repulsed, or at least afraid by what I'd found. Strangely, though, I only felt a pang of hunger. Odd that. I was dead. My body had no business being hungry, but all the same. I put the first two fingers of my left hand into the hole and felt around. There was no pain, but when I pulled my fingers out of myself, they were streaked with gore. Without thinking, I put them in my mouth and sucked them until they were clean. I thought about that for a long time, and anyone who might have seen me sitting there sprawled on the cold floor of the parking garage would have thought I'd come unplugged, or that I was dead. Another hoarse caw of laughter escaped me, and I staggered to my feet. Home. I would sort all this out when I felt less confused. I didn't remember what had happened, but I knew what had led up to that point. Right now, though, all I wanted was a shower. And food. God, I was hungry. I smoothed my ruined blouse and dug the keys to my car out of my pants pocket. Luckily, I'd died right beside my car, so I didn't need to hunt around, stumbling and aimless as a zombie in a movie. At least my thoughts were still my own, or so it seemed. When I depressed the unlock button on my keychain, it gave a satisfying double chirp, and I opened the door. Whatever had happened, it hadn't been robbery. I settled myself into the seat, doing my best not to get blood all over the interior of my car. When all was said and done, I still loved my car. It ran like a top, and it never, unlike most human beings in my life, let me down. Not to mention the killer stereo. Nothing moved me quite like deep, bone-rattling bass. I turned the key, and a perfect circle filled my head in such a satisfying way that I only sat there for a moment, head tilted back against the seat with a dreamer's smile on my lips. The song was one of my favorites. The Hollow, it was called. I didn't realize then just how very apropos the lyrics were. Life is full of irony. Apparently so was my own death. I drove home without incident. I showered and covered the hole in my torso with bandages. It wouldn't do to have someone accidentally finding that, never mind how it would ruin any piece of clothing I tried to wear without some kind of dressing. I'd tell anyone curious enough to ask that I had cracked ribs and the bandages were for extra support. I smiled at my own cleverness as I applied my makeup. My eyes had gone a bit milky with my demise, but I thought they looked interesting. I'd always had a bit of a taste for the macabre. They had gone from a dark shade of gray that looked almost like a liquid black in low light to a piercing, silvery blue color. Sadly, I suspected they would be well and truly terrifying to someone not very drunk, if I didn't have an extremely easy demeanor. My skin was also bone white. I had been pale in life. In death, I was nearly blue. I thought it lent me an ethereal mystique. I used to be beautiful. Now I supposed I was merely creepy. I had to be cautious. Oh, damn. If only I'd kept the colored trial contact lenses my optometrist had offered me. My eyes could be green tonight. But I only needed them for driving anyway, so I'd made the decision to keep my glasses rather than having to wrestle with the flimsy, ever-folding contacts. I sighed. No matter, really. It was close enough to Halloween that I could always claim I was going to some kind of costume party. It was too late to eat at a restaurant, so I opted for a nightclub. Surely there would be snack food at the very least, and I was ravenous. I couldn't remember ever having been so hungry. I moaned a little, feeling my stomach twist as I pulled into a parking space outside an establishment called the High Road, and got out of the car. It looked like a busy place, and I could smell meat cooking inside. My mouth began to water as I went in, and I found an empty booth near the back of the room. I noticed several men following my movement with hungry stares and smiled to myself. Even in death, I hadn't lost it. At least not yet. I slid into my seat and pulled a menu from behind the napkin dispenser. I read through its contents, but nothing sounded good to me. Even the steak, which was odd. I knew I needed meat. I must not have had enough proteins and iron because my body was craving meat, and rare meat at that. Fine. When the waitress finally came over to my table with her overly bubbly, "Do we know what we want this evening?" I wanted to take a bite out of her, but instead I said, "Steak." prayer. She said. I looked expectantly at her. What side dishes would you like with that? I ground my teeth as I looked at her stupid 20-something features, tamping down fantasies of pinning her down in my booth and eating her actual face. My God, what was wrong with me? Finally, I settled with a terse, surprise me. And a drink? Bring me a dry red wine. I didn't care enough to get more specific directions anymore. What I really wanted was blood. I knew the next thing she said would be the end of her, but to my relief in her continued existence, she finally left me alone. I took a deep and very unnecessary breath. Meat. Warm and pulsing. That was what I wanted. I wanted to hear the screams of the animal as I devoured it. I wanted to sink my teeth in and rip and tear. I was grinding my teeth still as a man sat across from me. I looked at him, not surprised and definitely not impressed. Hey there, he said. He was grinning. And he was chewing gum. I watched him grinding my teeth. He reminded me of Norm Macdonald doing his impression of Burt Reynolds with that chewing. I forced a rather mechanical smile. Hello there, I said. I still sounded sexy. I could see by the gleam in his beady eyes that he was imagining what my lips would look like wrapped around his cock. Men are all the same. An hour later, I'd eaten the steak and gotten Craig, that was his name, to pay for it all. I'd had 4 glasses of wine and I should have been drunk. I wasn't, unfortunately. Instead, I was looking into his watery brown eyes and thinking what a mercy it would be to end his pathetic existence. We went to his place. He drove, an old Ford Mustang. I imagined he was one of those guys who loved to relive the good old days back in high school when he was the football jock. It was most likely the pinnacle of his existence. I sat in the passenger seat and grinned at him when it was called for it, thinking of how it would look when I tore open his throat and the arterial spray of blood covered the walls behind us in an artistic pattern. That would be the most beautiful thing I'd seen since my death. I was quite looking forward to it, I found. Shall we have a little music? He asked when we had settled in his house. Sure, I said. I didn't care a whit. Music or no, I was going to eat this man. He put on something by U2. I didn't know the song, but there was no mistaking Bono's voice. He was warbling something about New Year's Day when Craig sank down onto the sofa next to me with 2 glasses in his ham-fisted hands. He shoved one expectantly at me, and smiling, he said, Like a little rum and coke? I didn't want it, but I smiled and took the drink, swirling it around in the glass a little. I took a cursory sip to his hearty gulp and then sat it carefully on the edge of his black, formica-top metal coffee table. Cheap and shabby, just like everything else in this hovel, just like Craig himself. Bono sang, I want to be with you night and day, and Craig studied my features. The most unusual eyes I think I've ever seen. I smiled indulgently at him. I'll take that as a compliment. Good. He gave me a lopsided grin that made me want to cave his teeth in and scooted closer to me. It was an awkward move, and I disguised my derisive amusement with a sultry, flirty laugh. He bought it, hook, line, and sinker. So, he said, trailing an index finger across my left collarbone. I was betting this was his smoothest move. Here we are. Clever. I nearly rolled my silvery eyes, but I managed to rein it in, barely. Instead, I said, mm-hmm. My come-hither gaze drew him further, and he leaned in to kiss me. Our lips met. Under a blood-red sky, Bono sang. I opened my mouth and closed my teeth on Craig's interloping tongue. I bit down hard, and he made a moaning sound that quickly escalated to an alarmed mewling that made its crescendo to a high-pitched squeal. I tasted blood as I felt his tongue give way. He pulled against me, ripping himself unintentionally. He pushed at my shoulders with the flats of his palms, and with a satisfying tear, I had the tender morsel in my mouth. I chewed thoughtfully, blood running down my chin in runnels as Craig clamped both hands over his bleeding mouth, eyes enormous with shock and pain and terror. I smiled at him around my mouth full of tongue, and as he moaned into his hands again and again, blood and drool intermingled and slid between his fingers to ooze down his hands, dripping over flesh as pale as paper, as pale as my own. He stumbled backward off the sofa and to his feet, but his right foot caught on the nearest leg of the coffee table, and he went down hard. He scuttled backward, propelling himself with his feet while his back chafed over the carpet. This harsh motion pulled his polo shirt taut over his throat so that his face began to color, pink at first, then darkening to a deeper, redder shade. I got smoothly to my feet as I swallowed Craig's tongue, licking at my fingers as I moved toward him. He tried to scream something at me, but nothing intelligible would come without the use of the tongue that was sliding down my throat. Oh, Craig, I cooed in mock sympathy. What's the matter? Can't catch your tongue. Craig began to scream. He continued his futile backward motion, but I was much quicker, and his back had fetched up against the wall now. I walked my legs out until I knelt over his knees and then crawled into his lap. His eyes rolled up to meet mine, and I wondered if he would faint. "Isn't this what you wanted, Craig?" I asked as I pushed myself down over his lap, stroking his body with mine even as I leaned in. I laced my fingers through his hair and tightened them into fists before yanking his head backward and darting forward with my strong teeth closing over his throat. His scream became a gurgle as I opened his throat, and then it died out altogether when I snapped my hands sharply backward and heard the sharp crack of bone breaking. The sound was satisfying to me in a way I'd never felt before. Now I couldn't wait to suck the marrow from the jagged shards. I moaned in ecstasy as I felt the blood still pulsing over my tongue, down my throat. I worried another piece of flesh away from Craig's throat and swallowed this one without chewing. It felt like I'd been starved for weeks, and I'd never been so frantic as I was at that moment to sustain my body. I sat back on my haunches and regarded Craig's empty and staring eyes. I tilted my head and smiled. It looked like he was deep in thought. My hand darted forward, and I deftly plucked his left eyeball from its socket, popping it into my mouth and biting down. It gave way and squelched over my tongue. Greedily, I reached into the empty socket to scoop out the gore that remained, but it wasn't enough. I looked around for something heavy, and after a moment my eyes settled on a marble-based trophy. It was a football trophy, no surprise there. I chuckled to myself as I unfolded my knees, lending me enough height to reach it. I brought it down hard on top of Craig's head, and more blood spilled from the new wound, though it didn't have the force of a beating heart behind it, so it was more a trickle than a spray. It ran down the side of his face. I withdrew the trophy, but the hole it had made hadn't been nearly enough. I brought it down again and again and again, grunting with my efforts as bone fragments splintered and flew until a fist-sized hole gaped at me like an open maw. Licking my lips, I reached into the hole and tore out a piece of Craig's brain. "Deep thoughts, Craig," I said and smiled as I closed my lips upon the slippery bite, and then closed my eyes as I finally began to feel a little relief. I didn't stop then. I feasted until I was so full I needed to sleep, and even then I took one last bite. There wasn't much left of Craig's brain. I rolled away from my meal and found his bedroom. I didn't pull the coverlet back. I'd no wish to sleep on those sheets. Instead, I curled myself into a ball and fell fast asleep. I didn't dream.